Everyone will begin momentarily. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a webinar talking about the future of old conflicts. As we've seen in recent weeks, both the closing or seeming closing of some old conflicts, as the declaration of intent to have a ceasefire in the 4-decade-long conflict between Turkey and the Kurdish terrorist group known as the PKK, and the resumption of some conflicts, as we've seen in Syria, with a renewed bout of violence, ethnic violence, between the now Sunni-led transitional regime and the Alawite community of former President and dictator Bashar al-Assad. I'm pleased to be joined by a group of experts who've studied the region closely. First and foremost, Ambassador Eric Edelman, a distinguished scholar at JINSA, an ambassador to Turkey, and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. JINSA's Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow John Hanna, and JINSA scholar Svante Cornell. Thank you all for joining me. I wanted to start perhaps in Turkey and then make our way south to Syria, but start with the news that at the end of February, Abdullah Ocalan, the jailed leader of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers Party, put forward this announcement calling for a ceasefire, calling for a laying down of arms, and perhaps opening the possibility of peace in this civil conflict that's been racking Turkey for the last 40 years. But Svante, can you give us some of the background of what did Ocalan call for and why is it significant?
Thank you, Blaze. It's good to be with you all today. And I think when we look at what happened with Mr. Ocalan, we have to look both at the near background and a little earlier too. Obviously, this was preceded by a quite unexpected move by the nationalist leader of Turkey and the partner of President Erdogan in the coalition, Mr. Devlet Bahçeli, who heads the Nationalist Movement Party, and really is very much a representative of the more nationalist types in the bureaucracy of the Turkish state and the intelligence and military wings of the state. When he, who had been the fiercest critic or the angriest opponent of the PKK and of the Kurds in Syria, when he reached out first and shook the hands of the Kurdish parliamentarians in the Turkish parliament, which he would not have done before, and then invited Mr. Öcalan to make exactly the kind of move he just did. With that, I want to say that this didn't happen in a vacuum. This obviously happened as a result of an outreach by the Turkish state and discussions that we know very little about between Mr. Öcalan's side, if you will, and the Turkish government. If we look back further, we have to acknowledge that in the past decade, pretty much in the past 10 years, there has been a on and off, if you will, process in which Mr. Erdogan's government, we should recall, at first was one that really made a case of its openness to discuss issues of Kurdish ethnicity and language that had not been talked very much about, that the state had suppressed discussion about in Kemalist Turkey. He got large amounts of votes for Kurds as a result of this. But as we saw, that didn't really lead anywhere for a number of reasons we can go into if you like. And obviously, by the time of the escalation of the civil war in Syria, we saw this greater confrontation between Turkey and the Kurdish movement. We have to acknowledge also that Mr. Assad played a number on Turkey when they tried to overthrow him by basically ceding a large portion of territory in northeastern Syria to the Kurds. Hence, very rapidly changing the priorities in Turkey, if you will, something, frankly, the Turks should have seen coming. So it's been very much on and off. After that, the Turkish government and Erdogan really gave up the idea of talking to the Kurds and went back to the old-fashioned military means of suppressing the PKK and other Kurdish organizations. So we can ask ourselves, why did this happen now? And I think obviously the process got started before the fall of the Assad regime, but I think we have to see it all in context of the weakening of Iran, of the rivalry between Turkey and Iran in the region, and also of a Turkey that sees a lot of vulnerabilities in the region surrounding itself, and saw a opportunity perhaps after having really destroyed a lot of the Kurdish ability of the PKK's ability to resist on the ground, to finally make a sue for some kind of deal that would get rid of this problem, this vulnerability inside Turkey that, from a Turkish perspective, is seen as something that foreign powers, and they include the United States, perhaps primary among this, are using to manipulate, undermine, and weaken Turkey. So I think that's the logic. And from the side of the PKK, I'm sure my colleagues here can speak more about the PKK and SDF side of things. But I think there is a certain understanding that they've reached the end of the road in many ways as far as an armed struggle against Turkey is concerned, particularly after their ability to continue to exist in a Syria that's now dominated by the Sunni Arabs, which are allied to Turkey, is shrinking rapidly.
Thanks, Fonte. Ambassador Edelman, maybe I could turn it to you, but ask, what's in it for Erdogan?
Yeah.
What's he
Well,
get at? If the Erdogan government is involved in negotiating this, what are they hoping to get out of it? Are they under military threat or pressure from the PKK or the Kurds more broadly, or why now, and what do they want to gain?
right. Well, first, let me just say that if indeed this brings an end to the insurgency, I think it will be good for, obviously, for the Kurds in Turkey. It'll be good for Turkey, and good for the region. The insurgency that has been going on for more than 40 years there has cost some 30 to 40,000 lives. It's been a very brutal insurgency with a very brutal set of counterinsurgency tactics applied by Turkey. So if this does in fact lead to a lasting peace, that would be all to the good. I would, however, sort of inject, as I think Svante did as well, a cautionary note here. There is a history to this. There have been previous efforts to do this. The last one really a decade ago in 2015, which ultimately came a cropper and actually led to some extraordinary violence against Kurdish cities in the southeast by the gendarme of Turkey, and lots of loss of human life. The one important thing I think whenever we're talking about Turkey, and particularly about the Erdogan government, to bear in mind is that for Erdogan, everything is rooted in domestic politics. And right now, in the wake of having lost a lot of ground politically in Turkey over the last couple of years with some very bad, in fact, the worst results he's had in an election, in the municipal elections last year, continuing problems with very stubborn inflation that despite really pretty aggressive effort by the central bank to tamp down, has just been fired up by so many years of profligate populist economic policies pursued by the Erdogan government, that they're having trouble controlling it. He is looking to figure out how he can get around the constitutional prohibition of succeeding himself as president in 2028. And this is one way to do it, by courting the Kurdish constituency in parliament. We still have a number of Kurdish mayors who were kicked out of their mayoral positions. So I think there's still a lot of other, kind of shoes to drop in this process to see how it plays out. But there's obviously a huge domestic political context to all of this for Erdogan.
Thanks, Ambassador. So I guess let me ask the flip side of that question to you, Svanti. What's in it for the Kurds? Do we have a sense of what they've been promised if they do, in fact, lay down arms?
Well, we know what's been in the talks when the negotiations were happening. And it's important to note, by the way, as an aside, that the Erdogan government, which obviously has been speaking very harshly about the PKK, decided a decade ago that instead of negotiating with the elected Kurdish members of parliament that were amassing at that time over 10, almost 13% of the vote, which would have been the normal thing to do, by empowering Kurds that are not, part of these terrorist organizations, although the Turks, say that they're linked somehow. They decided to go straight and talk to Öcalan. So big guy talks to big guy, if you will. We can talk more about that, but I think that was already a recognition by the Turkish side that the PKK somehow, whether you like it or not, has to be dealt with in terms of trying to bring an end to this conflict. Now, what was promised? At the end of the day, very little was promised, and it remains very questionable how much Turkey was actually just stringing along the Kurds versus actually having any intentions to make any serious concessions. So, first of all, what's out of the question? I think any kind of territorial autonomy is out of the question. I think we're talking about cultural autonomy type of things in terms of language right for the Kurds, and for obviously Kurdish political parties and so on. I'm the release of jailed Kurdish leaders, Selahattin Demirtas, and many others, some of the mayors that Ambassador Edelman mentioned. That's on the table. From the Kurdish side, obviously, they would like something more. They would like a renegotiation of really the concept of Turkish citizenship, if you will, if ideally to have Turkey accept that it's really a bi-national state, if you will, consisting of Turks and Kurds. I have a very difficult time seeing that that's going to happen. So I think that all remains to be done or discussed. The point is that at this point, especially after what happened in Syria, the negotiating position of the Kurdish side is relatively weak. So it's very much if Turkey can do this in a way that provides more than the bare minimum, I think it's a good time for Turkey to be able to settle this. But obviously, this movie has been a long time in the making, and there are many problems in the region that have to be overcome before we can really speak seriously about any success rate to this current initiative.
I guess Ambassador, what are the signposts we want to look to see if this is going to be a success, if this is something that actually takes root, and sort of what are the dangers of or signs that this might be falling apart as we go forward?
Well, I think as I was saying, and I think as Svante was indicating, I mean, you'd want to see essentially the end of the effort to delegitimize the Kurdish political party in Turkey that has been very successful. Return of the mayors to their elected function. Release of Selahattin Demirtas, the head of the party, who's been in prison now for a number of years on again completely fictitious charges of support for terrorism. There will have to be some further clarification, as Svante was saying, of exactly what the outlines of this cultural autonomy would be, since I agree with Svante that there's not going to be any kind of regional or territorial federalization of Turkey. That's just not in the cards. You're still going to have a unitary Turkish state. But if those negotiations don't actually take place and don't actually yield some practical results, there is a chance that you will see PKK fighters who have agreed to lay down their arms, or splinter groups either conducting terrorist actions in Turkey that could be very destabilizing, or activities in southeastern Turkey by paramilitary forces or the gendarme that could also kind of stir things up again. I mean, 10 years ago, the Turks were using artillery to level the center of several major Kurdish cities in Kurdish majority cities in southeastern Turkey. And I think they were running the risk of alienating a whole generation of Kurdish youth in southeastern Turkey. And, that there's still tinder there that could easily be ignited if one side or the other doesn't play ball here. And so those are the kinds of things I would be looking for. I defer to Svante, who is more expert on this than I.
I would be curious to get your thoughts, Fonti, but also wanted to ask about the political repercussions of this for Erdogan's current coalition, which, as you said, includes the nationalists who have historically been opposed to granting of any sort of rights or recognition for the Kurds. As you said at the outset, Bacheli has shaken hands, but with Kurdish leaders. But how far are they willing to go? Are they going to accept a new constitution that grants some form of cultural autonomy or language rights, like you've described, or are they going to get pushed aside and pushed out of Erdogan's coalition as other groups have in the past?
Well, your question really touches on one important point, which is how Turkey is currently ruled. And there are a couple of aspects to this. The first one is if you're talking about some kind of cultural autonomy, well, it's actually fairly simple. If you allow Turkish democracy to function, you automatically have a situation in which de facto the mayors of the southeastern parts of Turkey, the Kurdish populated areas, are elected by usually a pro-Kurdish party. And if you allow them to do their business, you effectively have a lot of cultural autonomy. But if you continue to have a state that doesn't tolerate this type of normal electoral politics, then it's going to be very difficult to have any agreement that is implemented in that Kurdish, I'm not even talking about the PKK, but that the more moderate democratic Kurdish movements can trust. So that's the first point. Other than that, I think the question really has to do with, or I think, put it differently, we can compare with what happened last time around. Last time around, that when Turkey had and this goes to your question about the constitution. Yeah, sure. I mean, Erdogan probably would like to change the constitution in many other ways. That might have to do with improving his ability to continue to control Turkey in a situation where he has, as Ambassador Edelman pointed out, a lower level of electoral support than he's ever had. Changes to the political party system, electoral rules, what have you, the power balance of power between the president and the parliament. There are all kinds of things in which Erdogan may want to make changes that are in his own interest. Well, if you throw in a couple of things that have to do with cultural autonomy and that give, a little bit of something to the Kurds, I think he would be happy to do that. Obviously, in the context of something that is, in his interest, broadly speaking. Whether that is enough to move the needle in any way, we'll have to see. But this is what happened with the last the last several amendments to the Constitution, including the big one in 2010, in which they changed a lot of things in the way the state was run, that really allowed Erdogan to assert control, while simultaneously throwing in a bunch of stuff that Western partners such as the United States and the EU thought looked like it would be amplifying political liberties and democratize the country, which obviously ended up being exactly the other way around. So we've seen this game being played before by Erdogan's government, and I'm sure this is exactly what's going to happen again.
Let me ask more pointedly, Svanti. The last time Erdogan was thinking about changing the constitution and making peace with the Kurds, and throwing overboard his then coalition partners, the Gulenists, who had a significant presence in the police and the judiciary and elsewhere, they fought back, both in terms of sort of the arrests and corruption cases that we saw in 2014, and then potentially and the coup that we saw in 2016. Now he once again has a coalition partner who is well situated in the security services in the form of the nationalists, and even sort of more radical factions of them, like the Eurasianists, who control parts of the intelligence and military and security apparatus. Is there another danger of his coalition partners turning on Erdogan if he's seen as throwing them aside?
If he goes too far in a certain direction, perhaps, but I think this is exactly why it was so significant that the very process was launched exactly by the people furthest right in the Turkish political system, if you will. If Erdogan had come out and done this, everybody would rightly have asked exactly the question you asked, what is going to happen to his coalition partners? Will there be an attempt by the, people in the security services or the military to stop this and to overthrow him? Well, apparently it looks like now it's them who started the process. Now, we don't really have time here to go into the intricacies of internal Turkish power balances, but I think it must be said that compared to a decade or so ago when Erdogan was at the top of his, personal power, I think we have a situation definitely following the coup attempt where there has been more of a power sharing. I mean, Erdogan is still a very powerful president. There is no question about that, both in terms of the formal authorities vested in the presidency and also in his informal authority over the Turkish state system. But he's not the only person who is a single decider. The state institutions, dominated by traditional Turkish nationalist forces, have gained influence. It was their understanding of how the Kurdish problem should be approached a decade ago that eventually won out. If you look at the foreign policy of Turkey today and you discount some of Erdogan's more radical pronouncements and look at what Turkey is doing, it looks a lot more like the late 1990s when there was a nationalist coalition in power than the, Muslim Brotherhood-oriented policy that Erdogan had 10 or 12 years ago. So again, without discounting, and I'm not at all discounting that Erdogan remains a very deep, perhaps definitely most powerful person in Turkey, but we have to ask the question, where did this initiative come from in terms of trying to settle the Kurdish issue? I would not be surprised if this is a consensus in which the nationalist forces in the Turkish state are very much part of having not only sanctioned being, but maybe even themselves being the originator together with Erdogan of this initiative.
Yeah,
So
I
what did
think
the national?
I think
Sorry,
it's
go ahead, Matt.
if I can, Blaze, I think it's also Svante, I'd be curious of your view here. But you know, Devlet Bahçeli, the head of the MHP, and his party have benefited, enormously over the last 15 years from their association with Erdogan. They've been consistently in the government. They're getting, government ministries are getting other privileges and perks, and no doubt some share of the corruption that's going on. And therefore, they have no interest in seeing the system overthrown and seeing Erdogan depart from the scene and be replaced by, say, Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, who has launched a campaign for the CHP, the Ataturk national, nationalist party that had been the normal governing party of Turkey for a long time, but has been in the minority now or in the opposition for quite some time since Erdogan took power. They don't have any interest in seeing CHP come back.
I agree.
Thank you both. Let me turn to John, and ask you about maybe the regional repercussions of if there is in fact a ceasefire and a peace deal between Turkey and the PKK. Given that the PKK itself has a presence outside of Turkey in Iraq and in Syria, and that the Kurds are obviously spread across neighboring states as well, what would the regional repercussions of this be?
Well, it's a good question, Blaze. I mean, turning to Iraq, first of all, of course, the PKK as an operational matter, that's where its command is, in fact, in those mountains in Kandil in northern Iraq. And to the best of my knowledge, I think they obviously have taken Erdogan's pronouncement seriously about laying down arms. But they've been under fairly constant attack by Turkish forces over the last few weeks, a pretty steady bombardment. So it doesn't look like a ceasefire has yet taken hold there. Some of the people out of Kandil have talked about actually the fate of Ocalan and maybe even getting Ocalan out of jail. It's not clear to me that the effects have yet been felt in Iraq, where Turkey remains very active militarily in northern Iraq, going after PKK positions. In Syria, it's obvious that's the big development of the last several days. I think it's the culmination of many, many weeks of diplomacy and back channels, including a lot of work in leadership by the U.S. military, by CENTCOM in Syria to try and make some kind of arrangement between our Kurdish allies in the SDF in northeastern Syria and the new government in Damascus to make some kind of arrangement with them. I think everybody in CENTCOM is operating under the assumption that the clock is ticking on the U.S. force presence in Syria, that at some point that is likely to go away. I think we've been making plans in the military for that withdrawal if the president decides, as he did during his first term, that he wants to get out of Syria. We've been communicating that to our Kurdish allies and suggesting there's some urgency now that with an administration that might not be long in Syria, with a Turkish government that has its allies now in Damascus, that is very unfavorable to the SDF military presence in northeastern Syria, that has its proxies applying pressure inside of Syria against the SDF, that the clock was running on the SDF, and they needed to try and make the best deal that they could under that kind of pressure, and they did that. And amazingly, they did it this week in the immediate aftermath of this awful massacre and slaughter that we saw over the weekend along the Syrian coast in these Alawite regions of Syria. And yet the Kurds in Syria went ahead and made their deal with this Sunni, at least in terms of its pedigree, jihadist extremist government in Damascus, presumably with some U.S. assurances that we're going to try and see this framework agreement through that would calls for the SDF's political and military structures to be integrated into the Syrian state, for the SDF to hand over airports and oil facilities that they control in the northeast and border points on the Iraqi border with the Syrian government that does recognize Kurdish rights and citizenship and Kurds as an important component of the Syrian people who will be able to participate politically in the state, which has not always been the case under the regime of the Assads. But again, it's a framework agreement. Everything will be in the implementation and execution. And it's hard to see, given just what the kinds of things we saw over the weekend, how you will actually get this agreement successfully implemented without a major role by the United States and some of its other friends in the international community. If it does get done, it's a huge deal. Even this framework announcement seemed to be very popular in many parts of Syria. People do see it as a major marker and issue that had been outstanding and that some progress has been made on, and essential to getting to a more stable post-Assad Syria. But there's a long way to go, obviously, just like the deal between Erdogan and Ocalan, to see whether or not all of these hopes that people are resting on these deals will get realized.
Thanks, John. A lot to unpack there. Let me maybe back up to Iraq for just a second, and the role of the KRG, and in particular its president, Barzani, who in recent weeks has met with leaders of Turkish Kurdish parties. He's been meeting with I guess he now calls himself Mazlum Abdi, the leader of the SDF, who has, I guess, tellingly dropped his nom de guerre and goes by a civilian name. Has the KRG had a role in making these deals happen? Are they an important partner either for Turkey or the U.S. in either of these deals? Do we know?
Oh, I certainly think they've been helpful. I think of all the parties inside Iraqi Kurdistan between the PUK and KDP, it's the Barzanis and the KDP that are probably seen as the best interlocutor for the Turks. And clearly the Barzanis at some level, they have their groups inside of Syria, their party inside of Syria, that has been kind of a rival to the SDF. But clearly, given the SDF, the pressure on it to try and reach some kind of accommodation, I think Barzani was clearly integral to encouraging the SDF that this was a move they should make, that the KDP would be helpful both with the United States, with the Turkish government in trying to help and facilitate that agreement. So, and the KDP has clearly welcomed both of these agreements, the one inside of Turkey internally and the one inside of Syria. They've welcomed that and applauded it, and I think there's every reason to believe that the KDP and Barzanis have played a positive and useful role, certainly for the United States and CENTCOM as part of this effort.
Blaise, could I make an observation, which is,
Please.
although the Turkish government has maintained consistently, and it's been a very neuralgic point in U.S.-Turkish relations, that the SDF and the YPG are completely controlled and owned, wholly owned subsidiaries of the PKK. It was striking that when Ocalan made his statement and his call to the PKK to lay down arms, there was nothing about Syrian Kurds in his statement or the SDF. That was unspoken. And equally, in this deal that has been negotiated between al-Shara and Mazlum Abdi, there is no mention of Rojava, the self-governing autonomous Kurdish region in northeastern Syria. No mention of regional or territorial autonomy. On the contrary, again, unitary Syrian state is the objective here. So I think that's all kind of worth noting. And I would just make a further observation, to John's point about the violence that took place along the coast. I guess two observations. One is, as awful as that was, I think we need to be very cautious about how we assess what's going on. First of all, we have lots of conflicting reports about exactly what happened, who hit whom first. That's not to excuse anybody, but it does seem that there may have been an Iranian hand here trying to, activate the, extant Assadist forces still in the coast in the Alawite heartland. That's point one. Point two, given the incredibly violent nature of this civil war that's raged in Syria over the last 15 years, what has been surprising to me has not been that we got violence like we saw this weekend, but that there's been so little of it, actually. And I think that's important to bear in mind, given the number of people who were killed, the incredibly repressive nature of the Assad regime over 50 years. So I think it's and given the lack of kind of eyes on the ground, I think as a general matter, people need to be very, very cautious about drawing very big conclusions from what we've seen happen.
Eric, I would just I don't think it's really very murky about what started the violence on Thursday night last week. It was the pro-Assad insurgency that's clearly been developing
Right.
in the mountains of the coastal areas of Syria. They
Right.
launched a multi-pronged attack on, I don't know, dozens
Right.
of the interim regime's security checkpoints, and as well as other installations in Latakia and the Tartus regions.
Yep.
They clearly started this. They're run by major former security officials in the Assad security system, the 4th Division, run by Maher al-Assad, the Republican Guards, with deep connections not only to the IRGC, but to Hezbollah. There's been plenty of talk in the Iranian press about the the Syrian Islamic Resistance Front, or whatever it is. I think this is a real insurgency. They even called it a coup.
Yeah.
The beginning of a coup against the new interim regime. Now, the response to that was just an absolute free-for-all, zero command and control, self-mobilization by every militia and jihadist left in Syria and Sunni who's got has been waiting 40 years to exercise vengeance for what the Assad regime did to their family in Hama or somewhere else. Much less what Bashar has been perpetrating over the last 13 years that led to the, really awful, awful atrocities and massacres that, thank God, for the moment have stopped. But I agree with you entirely. The fact that we went nearly 3 months without seeing blood in the streets like this was quite amazing. But it's a taste of what could be
out there.
Our way, and we've got to figure out how to whether there's anything that we can do as a country together with our allies who care about some minimal level of stability in Syria, what leverage we have to try and contain this really potentially awful situation that's staring us right in the face.
Totally agree, and I agree with everything you said, John. I guess what I really was trying to caution against was, while the response was clearly excessive and there were civilian, casualties that are, not acceptable by, any standard. I think there's been a kind of narrative that this is just the regime showing its jihadist roots, its true colors, etc. I'm cautioning against people jumping to that conclusion. I think there's plenty of room for skepticism about whether or not this regime has in fact shed its jihadist baggage. But I think what happened over the weekend should not be the final arbiter of whether they have or haven't, I guess, is what I was cautioning.
I guess, in fact, we've heard al-Shara since then sort of gave, I think, 2 speeches calling for some sort of commission of inquiry into what happened, and calling for greater peace and understanding. I guch one question is, how do we, if not by these actions, how do we judge them? What sort of should be the benchmarks of whether this is going to be a stable regime, a regime that we can support or work with in Syria? And I guess alongside that, if, John, as you said, this was sort of an outburst of sectarian violence, it wasn't necessarily something that was orchestrated or authorized by the regime, but more the action of rogue elements. How does this regime now exercise some control over these multiple militias and free flow of arms in Syria? How do they get a monopoly on the use of violence? Is that something that the U.S. or outside actors should be helping them do?
Very good question. I think a lot is up to Shara himself. I mean, remember, this is a guy who probably back last November didn't have any thought that he would actually be ruling Syria at this point in time. He's kind of the accidental president of this place, given the catastrophic success of their offensive into Aleppo that led them into Damascus a couple of weeks or a week later. It's a good question, Blaze, because not only, as we saw, are these sectarian hatreds obviously so much right at the surface, ready to be unleashed, but they're sitting on top of an absolute economic disaster and catastrophe. Syria is literally on its back in terms of its economy. So, what you haven't seen the new government do, they didn't do, they obviously dismissed the old security forces, but they did start some kind of amnesty process where they invited former regime elements to come up, own up to what they'd done, and then they could be potentially released back into the population. And that's happened to a lot of these people. I think there were 4,000 or 5,000 former top regime elements in the security services who didn't come forward, didn't trust that process, simply went back to the mountains. But these are a bunch of people out of the security services who may have some level of amnesty, but they don't have jobs. They don't have any form of payment or salaries. So lots of angry people with guns and very little ability on the part of the government, other than being able to issue all kinds of statements to get control of this, or even to have ways to incentivize these potentially very distrustful and disgruntled people who, again, have been at civil war for 13 or 14 years. One thing that I do think, to the extent clearly in this recent bloodletting over the weekend, that you have a lot of foreign jihadists still running around Syria, including Palestinian jihadists, but people from Chechnya, I think from Uzbekistan, who apparently were part of the multi-pronged effort to roll into Damascus, but they're still in the country. And as far as I can tell, he's taken no action to say, thanks for your service. Now it's time for you to leave. I think that's one action he could really take, is to do something against those people. And listen, going back to Turkey, Turkey's got this Syrian National Army that's got a lot of bad elements to it, and it's clear there were parts of the SNA that came down as well to mobilize into the coastal regions, that committed a lot of very bad acts as well. And so I think, the Turks have some responsibility. I think they want to help stabilize this government, but they've got a part to do in this as well. I guess the final thing I'd say is, this gets to a very difficult question that we have with regard to sanctions and easing these sanctions, because we do have a designated terrorist group that's now in control of this very fragile state, and an economy that's in the ditch, that isn't able to incentivize these fighters and to get some kind of economic activity going. We're obviously very cautious about lifting sanctions, but there are a lot of European and Gulf partners of ours who do want to get involved, but they do need, I think, a little more signs of encouragement from the U.S. administration that you've got to be very careful going in there. But there are things that we can do, probably, that would be, it's a risk worth taking to try and stabilize the situation and prevent the worst from happening. And of course, we're doing this at a time when U.S. assistance and U.S. NGOs and their ability to operate in Syria because of some of the actions we're taking domestically with regard to USAID and other efforts, that those are kind of, at least for the moment, very much on hold as well, and limit our ability to direct assistance into people that we want to help to try and stabilize and secure parts of the situation there.
Yeah, I would also
Thanks, Sean.
I would just
Yeah,
add
please.
to what John said, going back to the point he made earlier about CENTCOM planning to pull out our 2,000 or so folks that we've had in Syria for a number of years. I honestly think that this is a very small commitment by the United States. It's a very low profile, and we've taken very few casualties during the course of a decade of involvement there. But if we pull out, particularly if we do it quickly, we will lose whatever leverage we have, both over Shara, but also over other forces, including the Iranian-sponsored forces, and eyes on the kind of land bridge through which Iran has historically supplied its proxies in Syria. So I would argue that this is not the time, no matter what happens in any putative Erdogan-Trump phone call, for the United States to willy-nilly pull its forces out. I think we have some leverage because we don't have other instruments, as John was just saying. It may be the most important instrument we have, and I would be very chary about prematurely withdrawing it.
So let me try to bring in Svante for a question that John's comment raised, and then in the meantime, invite the audience, if you have questions for our panelists, to please submit them using the Q&A feature. If you type out your question, I'll read it out and pose it to our panelists. But while we wait for those questions, Svante, let me ask you, John sort of raised the question of Turkey's influence and their ability to possibly have a positive influence on the new regime in Syria. Could they be a stabilizing force, or is the fact that they are the main sponsor, in particular, of the Syrian National Army, the SNA, this militia that has been responsible both for attacking Kurds in the east and committing some of the atrocities against the Alawites over the weekend? Does that make Turkey part of the problem in Syria, and how does the U.S. thread that needle?
Well, I think it's really too early to tell. It depends on what the Turkish endgame is in Syria. You find some fears, concerns that Turkey will try to restore some kind of neo-Ottoman dominion over Syria. And I'm sure there are people in Turkey who would like this. On the other hand, I also think that there are two things that mitigate against that. The first is that the level of Turkish anticipation that their allies or satraps in Syria were going to be able to succeed that quickly, I think that's questionable. I think they may have been taken to a certain extent by surprise. And I say that because we saw not long before this happened that Turkey was actually pondering whether they were going to extend recognition to the Assad regime, and so much of the Arab world did, try to, basically restore a normal relationship with them. So I don't think they expected this to happen as quickly as it did. They certainly went with the flow when it did, so to speak, because at the end of the day, the Turkish opinion, if you will, on both Syria and on Iraq is that the Sunni Arabs should be running these countries. The fact that they're in the minority in Syria and the minority in Iraq is kind of beside the point. The natural allies for Turkey are the Sunni Arabs. On the other hand, I think the experience that Turkey had over the past decade in trying to develop a sphere of influence, if you will, which was the Turkish idea after the Arabs' upheavals of 2011, didn't work out very well. And I think it would be very surprising if the Turks didn't learn that the Arabs don't really like to be controlled by Turks. even if it's Arabs that you have supported, that you have armed, that you have trained, that you have paid for. There is a lot. I think the point is not lost on the Turks that it's going to be a much more complicated relationship, a two-way relationship, than they might want it to be. So that's number one. Number two is, I think, on the other hand, that the reality in Syria is that the HTS came to power so quickly that their ability to control Syrian territory is very, very limited. So in turn, the dependence on Turkey as the major foreign ally or partner or sponsor, if you will, is very, very clearly there. What that means at the end of the day and how that relationship develops, we'll have to see. But I think it's probably a much more complicated relationship than we think. And it could take a lot of different turns that we have yet to see. Now, the point I would like to raise in conjunction with this is the fact that we shouldn't forget that Turkey is going to be a problematic partner in any way and form. Turkey in Syria is going to be a problematic partner to deal with. But at the end of the day, would you rather like to have Iran as the dominant force in Syria and extend, its arc of domination rather than that I would like to call it, rather than the arc of resistance that they want to call it, all the way to the Mediterranean? Or would you like to be able to deal with a very troublesome NATO partner that sometimes goes very much against our interests, but that we nevertheless have certain abilities to influence and that we can talk to? I think we shouldn't forget that that's the reality that we're dealing with is vastly preferable to what we had a year ago in Syria. And I think there is every reason for the administration to really grab this by the horns and see if for whatever reasons the relationship between the Biden administration and Turkey was complicated. That's not only on the U.S., that's on the Turkish side as well. But we have a new administration. If they can grab this by the horns and try to build a relationship with Turkey over the Syria issue, I think there is much that can be done. We're not going to get everything we want, but I think it's definitely, we're in a vastly different position than we were.
John, we've talked about minorities in Syria. The position of the Kurds may be improved. The position of the Alawites somewhat perilous at the moment. But Charles Wax asks a question about a third minority in Syria, namely the Druze. And in particular, the conversations that have been had recently about Israel extending protection or possibly even annexing them. What is the situation there, and how should we think about it?
Well, first of all, I mean, Israel is clearly has done a lot of work in Syria over the last 3 months. Immediately upon the fall of the regime, it actually, at devastated Syrian military capabilities to make sure some advanced capabilities and air defense capabilities would not fall into the hands of this regime and would be cleared in case Israel has any future desire to overfly Syria for whatever reason in the future, that lane has been cleared. But Israel has taken up positions on the Syrian side of the Golan, most importantly on the high ground of Mount Hermon overlooking Damascus. They've set up checkpoints in certain Druze areas right on the border. They've declared their willingness to protect Druze, who, of course, Israel has a significant Druze minority of its own that are loyal and good citizens of Israel who fight in its army. So Israel has a deep domestic concern and interest with making sure that Druze communities near its borders are not subject to the kinds of threats and slaughter that we saw over the weekend along the coast. Now, the reality is that just as we did see this framework agreement between the Kurds and the interim regime in Damascus this week, we also did see a framework agreement emerge in the Druze-dominated province in Syria of Suwaida on the Jordanian border, where the Druze, despite Israel's declarations of intent to protect them, signed their own deal for whatever reason with the new authorities in Damascus. They're clearly, the Druze are not unified. There are parts of the Druze community in Syria that I think are quite attracted to the possibility of having some connection and protection with Israel, but it's by no means a consensus position of Syrian Druze. Israel even had threatened a week or two ago when some trouble emerged in a Druze neighborhood outside of Damascus, declaring that Israel was going to intervene if any action was taken and against that Druze neighborhood, and the Druze in that neighborhood worked out a deal with the interim government instead, and major violence was avoided. So we'll see. I'm sure if something bad happens in the Druze community, Israel will be there to try and help in any way it can. But at the end of the day, it's going to be up to Syrian Druze to figure out where they think their futures most lie. And I just don't think it's clear at this point in time, because they are making arrangements with the government in Damascus. What I would say, the only thing I would say at this point in time is that Israel remains very active, very skeptical of this government in Damascus, and if it needed any reason to be skeptical, what it saw happen along the coast this weekend, I think, was very good reason that at least in its neighborhood along that border on the Golan south of Damascus, Israel has got all the reason in the world to be very, very cautious in terms of letting go of any of that territory and land until it's got some real assurances from this new regime about the kind of relationship they see with Israel and they see with the rest of the country in Syria with all these minorities. And because, listen, the stuff we saw over the weekend along the Syrian coast don't look as much as anything as they look like what happened on October the 7th inside of Israel. And it's just another reminder that Israel is surrounded by a region where barbarism can spring up very quickly at a moment's notice. And the better part of wisdom is to be very strong, very cautious. Don't take anybody at their word. Take care of your interests. And only when they demonstrate to you conclusively that they're ready for peace do you begin to make any kind of concessions. And I think what happened this weekend only reinforces that in the mind of a lot of Israelis.
Thanks, John. I think that brings us to the end, unless Ambassador Edelman or Sponsi, any final words to conclude with? Well, I have a feeling this will not be the last of the developments in either Turkey or Syria that we'll be tracking and interested in. So I look forward to having all three of you back to discuss what happens next. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the audience for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Have a good afternoon, everyone.